What difference will this make when we go to the supermarket?
Well, you won't see a large increase in price, but what you may see is some of your favourite foods will go up slightly in price. And this is because of the very unexcitingly named common user charge.
Oh, gosh.
And that's what you've just been talking about. Now, just to give you a bit of context, because I realise the words common user and charge do not sound don't make riveting radio. But you recall we left the EU in December 2020. And all of British exports, that's goods going into the EU, were immediately subject to border checks, and that added costs to British goods going into the EU. But at the time, the UK wasn't ready to impose equivalent checks on goods coming into the UK from the EU. And in fact, these checks and charges that went with it have been delayed 5 times. But the government, from the start of this year, from the start of 2024, has started to introduce these checks. It started with paperwork on goods coming into the UK from the EU on the 31st of January. And then what's going to happen at the end of this month, i.e. the end of April, are physical checks on what are called sensitive products, so animal products, plant products. And these physical checks, there'll be random checks, but all products have got to bear this common user charge, the thing I've just mentioned.
I see.
And there will be a cost. And the cost is maximum of £145 per load. So for big players, not very significant, but for much smaller businesses, and they're the ones who are worried, it will add to their costs. And either they have to take those costs on board themselves, or they'll have to pass them on to the consumer. And that's where the fear that inflation comes from.
So if I'm a cheesemaker in France and I want to ship 3 rounds of cheese, I don't know, 25 kilograms from Bordeaux to Kent, how is that £145?
Well, no, because it's up to a maximum of 5, and you've only done 3. But if
3 rounds of cheese.
Yeah, well, three different types of cheeses that are going to be covered. But if you were shipping, say, salami and yoghurt and a fish product and various other types of meat, it would be up to £145. And the person who's liable to pay is actually the UK importer. Now, they may decide to try and pass the costs on to the EU producer, but of course the EU producer may well say, well, actually, we're not going to pay those additional costs. We can sell our products across all of the other EU states. We don't need to bother with selling to the UK because it's additional hassle. And therefore, that's one of the reasons why people say we might actually see fewer goods coming to the UK because the EU just doesn't want to bother to export to the UK.
Catherine, the fee has been introduced to pay for these border inspections and to fund new facilities in Kent. And it's quoted as saying it's to protect biosecurity, preventing the import of plant and animal disease. But many will ask, considering we didn't have these checks while we were in the EU, why do we need to have them now?
Well, that's actually a very good question because, in fact, a lot of our regulation is still very much in line with the EU's regulation. However, of course, because we're outside the EU, we're not cooperating with the EU in the way that we were before, and there is genuine concern that rogue meat in particular is getting into the UK and is not being that's not being properly checked. And of course, because we're not in the EU, we're not cooperating with the French and Belgian customs officers as we used to. But in reality, the fact is we have been letting all of these goods in check-free up until the start of this year, and the sky hasn't fallen in. So the question is, why are we introducing all of these checks now? The answer is because the UK exporters are having to bear the costs when they import or they export into the EU, and at the moment EU exporters, those who are importing goods into the UK, are getting a free hit. And of course, lots of producers saying that's not fair.
Okay, so this is really helping me understand this because I've got to admit it's difficult to get your head around, but it looks like some prices will go up, but we're not clear exactly how much, say, if we're buying a piece of cheese in the supermarket, but certainly potentially by a couple of pence. What about where this is happening? And I'm talking about the location here, because this is goods entering the UK from the EU through the port of Dover and the Eurotunnel in Folkestone. And we know about a third. I've stood on those above those ports so many times as a reporter on news channels talking about goods coming in. We know about a third of goods from the EU come in that way into the UK. But what about the other ports? What about the other places in the UK? What are the checks going to happen there?
Well, that's interesting because it's largely a devolved matter. In other words, it's for the Scottish and Welsh governments to decide what they're going to do and how they're going to charge. At the moment, all of these rules are focused on Dover, and so goods coming in by ferry, and also on the Eurotunnel.
Wow. So wouldn't you just send them to another port?
Well, that's the risk, isn't it? But I think down the line, the plan is, of course, it will be rolled out right across England. Of course, it being a devolved matter, Scotland and Wales have to decide how to deal with it.
Catherine, thank you so much. You really helped a lot of us get our head around. We'll have to speak to you again when they expand it to different courts.